The knock came just before dawn. 3 weak taps against the wooden door, then silence. The kind of silence that pressed against the man's chest like a stone. Caleb Morrison woke with a start, his hand reaching for the Springfield rifle beside his bed before his eyes fully opened. 12 years since the war ended, but some instincts never died. They just waited, coiled in the darkness, ready to strike. Montana winter pressed against the cabin walls. Wind howled through the pine trees like wolves on the hunt, rattling the single window, finding every crack in the timber. Caleb had heard coyotes scratching at his door before. He had heard bears in the autumn hungry and desperate before the long sleep. He had heard mountain lions screaming in the night like women in pain. But this sound was different. Human. Desperate. Dying. He lit the kerosene lantern with stiff fingers, the flame casting dancing shadows across the rough, hewn walls. His breath came out in white clouds as he pulled his sheepskin coat over his union suit and crossed the cold floor. The boards creaked under his weight, a sound he had grown to hate in the 3 years since Maggie died. Every creak reminded him he was alone. Every shadow reminded him of what he had lost. The knock came again, softer this time, weaker. Caleb lifted the heavy iron latch and pulled the door open. The lantern light spilled out into the darkness, and what he saw there would change his life forever. A woman stood on his threshold, so thin that her cheekbones jutted through her skin like they were trying to escape. Her brown hair hung loose and wild in the wind, tangled with ice crystals. Her gray eyes were sunken deep in their sockets, rimmed with exhaustion and something worse. Something that looked like surrender. In her arms, she clutched an infant wrapped in a threadbare blanket. The baby's lips were blue. Behind her, 4 more children huddled in the snow. The oldest was a girl, maybe 9 years old, with eyes too old for her face. She held twin boys against her sides, trying to shield them from the wind with her own thin body. The twins looked about 6, their faces hollow, their eyes enormous. And clinging to the woman's skirt was a toddler, perhaps 3 years old, with rags wrapped around her feet instead of shoes. None of them were crying. They had moved beyond tears into that terrible silent place where the body conserves every drop of moisture, every ounce of energy for the simple act of survival. The woman swayed on her feet. Caleb caught her arm before she fell, feeling nothing but bone beneath the worn fabric of her dress. "Please," she whispered. Her voice cracked on the word like ice breaking on a spring river. "Take my children." She tried to push the infant toward him, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the baby. "Take them. I will go. I will walk into the snow. Just save them." Caleb did not think. His body moved before his mind could catch up, guided by instincts he thought had died with his wife and son. He pulled them inside, all of them, herding the children through the door like a shepherd gathering lost lambs. The 9-year-old resisted, planting herself between Caleb and her mother, her small fists clenched. "Do not hurt Mama," the girl said. Her voice shook, but her eyes did not waver. Caleb knelt down to her level, meeting those ancient eyes in that child's face. "I will not hurt your mama, I promise." "Adults always promise," the girl said. "Then they lie." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. This child had seen things no child should see. She had learned lessons no child should have to learn. "I am Caleb Morrison," he said, "and I do not lie." He had earned the right to make such claims. 5 years of war had taught him the cost of broken promises. 5 years of homesteading, under the Homestead Act of 1862, had taught him the value of a man's word. 160 acres of Montana wilderness claimed with nothing but sweat and blood and the stubborn refusal to quit. Every fence post driven into the frozen ground, every log cut and hauled and notched into place, every seed planted in soil that fought back with rocks and roots and endless storm and endless cold. This land was his, not because anyone had given it to him, but because he had taken it from the wilderness with his own 2 hands. And if he said he would not lie, then by God, he would not lie. The girl studied him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she stepped aside. Not all the way, just enough to let him pass. Still watching, still wary, still ready to fight if she had to. She reminded him of a wolf cub he had found once years ago, half-starved and shivering in a snowdrift, but still baring its teeth at anyone who came close. He had fed that cub, nursed it back to health. And one spring morning he had watched it disappear into the forest wild and free and owing him nothing. Some creatures could not be tamed. They could only be given the choice to trust. He rose and moved to the cast iron stove, throwing in pine logs, pumping the leather bellows until flames roared to life. Heat began to spread through the cabin, pushing back the deadly cold. The children drifted toward the warmth like flowers turning toward the sun. Their small hands stretched out, their fingers red and swollen with the early stages of frostbite. The woman collapsed into the rocking chair by the stove. Maggie's chair, the chair where his wife had sat every evening, humming softly as she mended clothes or knitted blankets for the baby that would never be born. No one had sat in that chair for 3 years. The woman held the infant against her chest, her body curving around the baby as if she could shield it from the world with nothing but love and bone. "When did they last eat?" Caleb asked. "4 days," the woman said. Her voice was flat empty, like a well that had run dry. "Real food longer." Caleb's stomach turned. He looked at the children's faces and saw his own son in them. The son who had died in Maggie's arms, both of them taken by a winter that showed no mercy. The son who would have been 3 years old now, just like the little girl clinging to her mother's skirt. 4 days, in this cold, with children. He moved to his stores without another word. 4 eggs from his 6 remaining hens. Half a sack of pinto beans he had been saving. Salt pork sliced thin, the last of his weekly ration. He fried the eggs in the cast iron skillet, boiled the beans in the pot, laid the salt pork in strips across the hot metal until it sizzled and curled. It was everything he had. 1 week of food for one man, now one meal for 6 starving souls. He did not hesitate. He did not calculate. He simply cooked. When he set the plates on the rough wooden table, the children fell upon the food like wolves on a wounded deer. The twin boys shoveled eggs into their mouths with their bare hands, grease running down their chins. The toddler gnawed on salt pork, making small sounds of pleasure. Only the oldest girl ate slowly, methodically, her eyes never leaving her mother. The woman pushed her plate toward the infant. "For when she wakes, you eat," Caleb said firmly. "She is sleeping. You are not." The woman hesitated, then obeyed. She ate mechanically, tears streaming down her face as if the simple act of accepting food had broken something inside her. Caleb turned away. Shame was a private thing. He understood that better than most. When the plates were empty, the children sat back, their eyes glazed with the first fullness they had felt in weeks. The toddler climbed into Caleb's lap without asking, curled against his chest like a kitten seeking warmth, and fell asleep. Caleb froze. He did not know what to do with his hands. Not since Maggie died had he held a child. Not since those final dark days had small fingers gripped his shirt, had a warm weight pressed against his heart. Finally, slowly, he wrapped one arm around her. She was so light, like holding a bird, like holding a dream that might dissolve at any moment. "My name is Eleanor Dawson," the woman said softly. "Most people call me Ellie. This is Hannah," she pointed to the 9-year-old. "Thomas and William, the twins. We call them Tom and Will. Rose." The toddler in Caleb's arms stirred at her name. "And Grace." The infant opened her eyes briefly, then closed them again. "Caleb Morrison, why are you doing this?" Morrison. Caleb looked at the sleeping toddler in his arms, at her small hand curled against his chest, at the way her breath came soft and steady now that she was warm, because someone should have done it sooner. Ellie's face crumpled. She covered her mouth with her hand, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Hannah moved to her mother's side, small hand on her back, offering comfort she should not have to give. Caleb waited. He was good at waiting. 3 years of waiting for death to take him too had taught him patience. When Ellie composed herself, she spoke again. Her voice was flat, reciting facts like a witness in a courtroom. "My husband died 6 weeks ago, Daniel Dawson. He was a silver miner at Granite Mountain. The doctor said it was fever." She paused, something flickering in her gray eyes. Something that looked like doubt. "By the time I borrowed the money to pay the doctor, it was too late. And after the landlord evicted us 3 days after the funeral. The churchwomen said I was improvident, said my husband's death was God's judgment for our debts." Ellie's voice hardened. "I tried everything. Washing clothes, mending, cooking for the miners. No one would hire me. The wife of a man who died in debt is bad luck, they said. So I started walking. I knocked on every door in Redemption Springs. 23 doors. 23 people who looked at my children and closed their doors in my face." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew Redemption Springs. He knew its people. He knew how quickly they turned their backs on anyone who could not pay. You walked 5 miles, he said, in this cold, with children, without shoes. Ellie looked down at Rose's feet at the rags wrapped around them. We had shoes when we started. The snow took them. Caleb looked around his cabin. One room, one bed, shelves nearly bare. Flour down to the bottom of the sack. Beans almost gone. Enough food for one man through March. For 6 people, maybe 2 weeks. Where will you go? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Ellie had no answer. She just looked at him with those gray eyes, waiting for him to do what everyone else had done, waiting for him to send her back into the snow. I should leave, she said. You have been kind, more kind than anyone, but I cannot burden you further. Where will you go? Caleb asked again. Silence. Caleb shifted Rose in his arms. She murmured in her sleep, her small fingers tightening on his shirt. You will stay, he said. We will figure out the rest. You do not have enough food. Then I will get more. How Caleb did not know. Not yet. But he had survived the war. He had survived losing Maggie. He had survived 3 winters alone in this cabin, waiting for death to take him. He would survive this too. And so would they. Because I know what hungry feels like, he said. I know what cold feels like. I know what it is to knock on doors that will not open. That is enough. Tom and Will had fallen asleep against each other by the stove, their small bodies tangled together for warmth. Hannah watched Caleb with cautious hope, as if she wanted to believe him but did not dare. Ellie held Grace close, searching his face for deception, for cruelty, for the trap she had learned to expect from the world. She found none. Why, she whispered again. Caleb looked at the sleeping children, at this woman who had walked through hell to save them, at the life that had suddenly filled his empty cabin. Because my wife would have wanted me to. The words surprised him. He had not spoken of Maggie to anyone since the day they lowered her into the frozen ground. But they were true. Maggie would have thrown open that door. Maggie would have given away every scrap of food. Maggie would have fought like a wildcat to save these children. Maybe that was why they had come to his door. Maybe Maggie had sent them. That night, Caleb gave the children his bed. They piled in together, Hannah on the outside, the twins in the middle, Rose curled between them like a kitten in a basket of yarn. Grace slept in a drawer lined with blankets, the closest thing to a cradle Caleb could fashion. Ellie lay on the floor beside her, close enough to reach out and touch her baby in the darkness. Caleb took the rocking chair by the stove. He stared at the ceiling beams, at the initials carved into the wood. C+M 1880, him and Maggie, their wedding year. The year they had built this cabin with their own hands, dreaming of the family they would raise within its walls. The memories came unbidden. Maggie's laugh bright as sleigh bells. Her hand in his as they watched the sun set over the mountains. The way she hummed while cooking, always the same song, a hymn her mother had taught her. Then the blood. So much blood. And the midwife's face pale and drawn when she said the words that ended Caleb's world. I am sorry, Caleb. They are gone. Wife and son both. Winter had taken them, just like it took everything in this hard country. He had carved those initials the day they moved in, full of hope and love and plans for the future. Now they mocked him, a monument to everything he had lost. A floorboard creaked. Caleb looked up to find Ellie standing there, Maggie's shawl wrapped around her shoulders. He had placed it there earlier without thinking. It had hung on its hook since the day of the funeral, untouched, gathering dust. I should go, Ellie said softly. Why, I am a burden. You do not have enough food. You do not have enough room. You do not need a woman with 5 children dragging you down. Caleb studied her in the firelight. This woman who had walked 5 miles in a blizzard to save her children, who had been willing to walk into the snow and die so they might live, who had knocked on 23 doors and kept going when each one slammed in her face. You are not a burden, he said. You are a mother protecting her children. That is not weakness. That is strength. Ellie shook her head. The town called me shameless for begging. Said if I was a decent woman, God would have provided. Caleb felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden as lightning. God did provide. He sent you here. Ellie's eyes widened. She pulled the shawl tighter, as if it could shield her from kindness she did not know how to accept. I can work, she said. I can cook. I can clean. I can mend. I can earn our keep. You already have. How Caleb gestured at the cabin, at the sleeping children, at the fire crackling in the stove, at the sense of life that had not existed 12 hours ago. You woke this house up. Ellie looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. At the rough-hewn walls, solid and strong despite their simplicity. At the stone fireplace blackened by years of use but radiating warmth like a beating heart. At the hand-carved furniture, each piece showing the marks of patient labor and quiet skill. You built all this yourself, she said. It was not a question. Caleb nodded. Me and Maggie. We had nothing when we came here. Just 2 mules, a wagon full of tools, and more hope than sense. He paused, remembering. She was stronger than she looked. Could swing an axe almost as well as I could. Never complained, not once, even when her hands bled and her back ached and the winter seemed like it would never end. What happened to her? Caleb was quiet for a long moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind had died to a whisper. Childbirth, he said finally. The baby came early. There was bleeding. The midwife did everything she could, but sometimes everything is not enough. He looked at the ceiling beams, at the initials carved there. I buried them both behind the cabin, right where the first wildflowers bloom in spring. I am sorry, so am I. Caleb looked back at her, but sorry does not bring them back. Sorry does not fill the empty spaces. All I can do is keep living, keep working, keep putting one foot in front of the other until the pain becomes something I can carry instead of something that carries me. Ellie wiped her eyes. Daniel used to say something like that. He said grief was like a stone in your pocket. You could not throw it away, but you could learn to walk with the weight. Smart man, he was. Ellie's voice caught. He was kind and hardworking, and he loved his children more than anything in the world. He deserved better than what happened to him. Most people do, Caleb said quietly. But deserve has nothing to do with what we get. All we can control is what we do with it. They sat in silence after that, 2 people bound together by loss, finding in each other's presence a comfort that words could not provide. The fire burned low, the children slept, and somewhere outside the first gray light of dawn began to creep across the snow. Ellie sank into the chair across from him. Grace stirred in her drawer cradle, and Ellie rocked it gently with one foot. The motion was automatic, maternal, ancient as time itself. They sat in silence for a long moment. 2 people carved hollow by loss, filling the quiet with understanding that needed no words. Then Caleb saw it. Ellie reached out to adjust Grace's blanket and her sleeve rode up. In the flickering firelight, he saw a mark on her inner wrist. Not a scar from accident or injury. This was deliberate. A letter burned into her skin. The letter D. Ellie caught his gaze. The color drained from her face. She yanked her sleeve down, but it was too late. Ellie, Caleb said softly. Please, her voice was barely a whisper. Please do not ask. Not yet. Caleb nodded slowly. He had his own scars, his own secrets, his own wounds that could not bear the light. He would not force her to expose hers. But the question had been planted. Like a seed in frozen ground, it would wait for spring. And when the thaw came, it would grow into something that would change everything. Outside, the wind died down as dawn approached. The first gray light crept through the window, painting the snow in shades of pearl and silver. Inside the cabin, 6 people breathed steady and warm. For now, that was enough. Caleb looked at the initials carved in the ceiling beam. C+M. Caleb and Maggie, his past, his loss, his 3 years of living death. Then he looked at the woman across from him, at the children sleeping in his bed, at the infant in the drawer that had once held Maggie's wedding dress. His future, his redemption, his second chance. He did not know yet what the letter D meant. He did not know what darkness Ellie carried. He did not know what enemies would come or what battles he would have to fight. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would die before he let anyone hurt this family. 10 days passed like a slow thaw. The cabin transformed in ways Caleb had not thought possible. Where there had been silence, now there was laughter. Where there had been dust and neglect, now there was order and warmth. Where there had been one man waiting to die, now there was a family learning to live. Ellie worked from dawn until long past dark. She mended the torn curtains with fabric from her own worn dress, her needle flashing in the firelight like a tiny silver fish. She scrubbed the wooden floors until they gleamed, erasing 3 years of grime and sorrow. She organized Caleb's haphazard supplies with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who knew the value of every grain of flour, every pinch of salt, every bean in the jar. Hannah learned to bake bread. Caleb taught her using the sourdough starter his mother had brought from Ohio 20 years ago, the same starter that had fed his family through war and drought and hard winters without end. The girl measured carefully, her small hands dusted with flour, her forehead creased in concentration. She kneaded the dough until her thin arms trembled with exhaustion, but she never complained, never stopped, never gave up. She reminded Caleb of Maggie, that same fierce determination, that same refusal to surrender. The twins followed Caleb everywhere. Tom and Will, 6 years old with matching brown eyes and gap-toothed smiles that emerged more often as the days passed. He taught them to stack firewood, dry wood on the inside, green wood on the outside to season. He taught them to feed the chickens, scattering corn evenly across the frozen ground. Why does it have to be even? Mr. Caleb Will asked one morning, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. Because fair is fair, Caleb said. In a family, no one gets left behind. No one goes hungry while others feast. Tom looked up at him, 6 years old, but somehow ancient. Are we your family now? Caleb paused, the corn bucket heavy in his hand. He looked at these two small boys, thin as rails, their clothes patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible. He thought of the son he had lost, the boy who would have been 3 years old now, the boy who had never taken a breath outside his mother's womb. Yes, he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. You are my family now. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Caleb taught the twins to read animal tracks in the snow. Deer here moving slow, probably injured. Rabbit there zigzagging to confuse predators. Wolf prints along the tree line circling but keeping their distance. The boys listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word like sponges soaking up water. How do you know all this? Tom asked one morning, crouching beside a set of prints that Caleb had identified as mountain lion. My father taught me. Caleb knelt beside the boy, pointing out the distinctive pad marks, the absence of claw prints that distinguish cats from dogs. And his father taught him, and his father before that. Knowledge does not come from books, son. It comes from paying attention, from watching and listening and remembering. We'll trace the print with one finger. Will you teach us everything your father taught you? Caleb looked at the two boys, their faces eager, their trust absolute. He thought of his own father, dead now, 10 years buried in Ohio's soil he would never see again. He thought of the son he had lost, the boy who would never learn to track or hunt or build a fire from nothing but flint and determination. Everything I know, he said. Every single thing. Hannah learned differently. She watched from a distance, at first too proud or too cautious to ask for help directly. But Caleb noticed the way her eyes followed his hands when he repaired a broken hinge, the way she lingered near the barn when he tended the horse, the way she studied his movements with an intensity that reminded him of himself at that age, hungry for knowledge, desperate to be useful. One afternoon, he found her struggling to mend a tear in her brother's shirt. Her stitches were uneven, her thread tangled, her face red with frustration. Here, Caleb said, settling onto the bench beside her, let me show you something. He took the shirt from her hands, not taking over, but guiding, showing her how to hold the needle, how to space the stitches, how to pull the thread tight enough to hold, but not so tight that it puckered the fabric. My mother taught me, he explained when Hannah looked at him in surprise. Said every person should know how to mend their own clothes. Man or woman does not matter. Self-reliance is not about being alone. It is about being capable. Hannah practiced until her fingers ached. By evening, she had mended not just the shirt, but 2 pairs of trousers and a hole in Rose's only dress. Her stitches were still uneven, but they held. And when she showed her mother what she had done, the pride in her eyes was worth more than gold. You are a good teacher, Ellie told Caleb later, after the children had gone to bed. Patient, kind. Not everyone is. I had good teachers, Caleb replied. Seems only right to pass it on. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then she said, almost too softly to hear, they needed a father. I did not realize how much until I saw them with you. Caleb did not know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and turned back to the fire, his heart full of something he had not felt in 3 long years. Hope. And then there was Rose. The 3-year-old attached herself to Caleb like a shadow. She followed him to the barn. She sat beside him while he repaired tools. She climbed into his lap every evening and fell asleep against his chest, her small hand curled around his finger. At first, she called him Mr. Taleb, stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Then it became Mr. Caleb. And then one evening, as he lifted her up to see the stars through the window, she said the word that cracked something open in his chest. Papa Caleb, can I sleep with you tonight? Caleb stood frozen. The word echoed in the small cabin like a gunshot. Papa. 3 years since anyone had called him that. 3 years since he had dreamed of a son calling him father of small feet running across the floor of a child's voice saying goodnight. Ellie stood at the stove, her back to them, but Caleb saw her shoulders tense. She did not turn around. She simply waited. Yes, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. You can sleep with Papa. Rose beamed at him, all innocence and trust, unaware that she had just given him a gift beyond price. She did not know about Maggie. She did not know about the baby buried behind the cabin. She only knew that this big, quiet man kept her warm and fed and safe. And that was enough. For both of them. Caleb caught Ellie watching him sometimes. Quick glances across the room when she thought he was not looking. Her gray eyes held something he could not quite name. Gratitude, yes, but something else too. Something warmer. Something that made his heart beat faster despite the guilt that came with it. Their hands brushed, reaching for the same cup one morning. Both of them pulled back as if burned. Their eyes met across the room and held a beat too long. At night, lying in their separate spaces, both of them lay awake listening to the other breathe. But survival came first. Romance was a luxury they could not afford. Not yet. Not with winter still howling at the door and supplies dwindling by the day. On the 10th day, Caleb counted what remained. 2 cups of flour, half a sack of pinto beans, cornmeal for maybe 4 more meals, salt enough for a week, sugar gone entirely. The chickens were laying poorly in the cold, giving only 2 or 3 eggs a day for 6 hungry mouths. He had calculated his stores to last one man through March. For 6 people, they would be empty in 2 weeks. Caleb took out his father's pocket watch. A Waltham solid gold worth $60 if he could find an honest buyer. The watch had belonged to his grandfather. Ezekiel Morrison had crossed the ocean from Scotland, had ticked through 3 generations of births and deaths and marriages. It was the last valuable thing Caleb owned. He held it in his palm, feeling its weight, hearing its steady tick. Then he put it in his coat pocket and saddled his horse. Redemption Springs lay 5 miles to the south. Caleb rode in at noon, the town square bustling with Saturday commerce. Men clustered outside the saloon, their breath steaming in the cold air. Women hurried between shops, baskets on their arms. Children chased each other through the muddy slush, laughing and shouting. Normal life, ordinary life. The kind of life that had been denied to Ellie and her children. Caleb tied his horse outside Pemberton's Mercantile and steeled himself for battle. The bell chimed as he entered. Horace Pemberton looked up from behind the counter, his small eyes narrowing as he recognized his customer. Morrison. The shopkeeper's voice dripped with false friendliness. Heard you took in the Dawson widow. That is right. Pemberton smirked, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. Mighty charitable of you. Whole town is talking about it. I need supplies. Flour, beans, salt pork, sugar. I can pay with this. Caleb placed the pocket watch on the counter. Pemberton picked it up, turning it over in his thick fingers, examining it with the practiced eye of a man who knew the value of everything and the worth of nothing. Waltham, nice piece. But I do not take pawned goods, cash only. It is worth $60. You know that? Maybe so. But rules are rules. Pemberton pushed the watch back across the counter. Besides, you still owe $12 from last spring's seed purchase. The door opened behind Caleb. Cold air swept in along with the rustle of silk and the scent of lavender perfume. He did not need to turn around to know who had entered. Mr. Morrison. The voice was cold enough to freeze water. Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt, the deacon's wife, swept past him in her black morning dress, her nose wrinkling as if she had encountered something foul. I hear you are harboring that woman and her brood of illegitimate children. Mrs. Dawson is a widow with 5 children. Not a criminal. A decent woman does not go begging door to door like a common vagrant. Mrs. Pruitt sniffed. The Reverend says if you intend to keep her under your roof, you had best marry her properly. Otherwise, you are living in sin before God and this community. Caleb felt heat climb his neck. Not anger, realization. She was right. Not about sin, about protection. A wife had legal rights in Montana territory. A dependent had none. If Caleb died, Ellie would be homeless again, cast out into the cold with 5 children and no legal claim to anything. But a wife could inherit land. A wife could own property. A wife could not be turned away. Marriage was not romance. It was survival strategy. I will consider it, Caleb said evenly. He turned back to Pemberton. $3. What will that buy? The shopkeeper sighed, making a show of his generosity. 10 pounds of flour, 5 of beans. That is all. Fine. Caleb took the meager supplies and left before his pride could sabotage him further. Outside, the winter sun had disappeared behind gathering clouds. The air smelled of coming snow. Reverend Samuel Whitfield stood waiting by Caleb's horse, 62 years old, white-haired with kind eyes beneath bushy brows. A good man in a town with too few of them. A Union Army chaplain who had seen the same horrors Caleb had seen, who understood what war did to a man's soul. Son, the Reverend said. Got a minute, Caleb nodded. I will not preach at you. Whitfield's voice was gentle but firm. But Mrs. Pruitt has a point, even if she makes it poorly. That woman's reputation is hanging by a thread. Yours too, and reputation matters in a place like this. I do not care about my reputation. Maybe you should. For her sake. Caleb looked at the old minister. You think I should marry her? I think if you are committed to caring for her and those children, making it legal protects everyone. Whitfield paused, a slight smile crossing his weathered face. And I have seen how she looks at you when you are not watching. How you look at her. This is not just charity, is it? Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. He had not let himself think that far. Had not dared to hope. I will talk to her, he said finally. Good man. Whitfield clapped his shoulder. Come see me when you are ready. I will waive the fee. Caleb was untying his horse when the black carriage rolled to a stop beside him. It was the finest carriage in the territory. 4 matched horses, black as midnight. The body gleamed with fresh lacquer, the wheels rimmed with silver. The kind of carriage that announced its owner's wealth and power before he ever stepped out. Silas Blackwood descended like a king, surveying his domain. 55 years old. Silver hair swept back from a high forehead. A neatly trimmed beard going gray at the edges. Black wool coat reaching to his knees, gray leather gloves, and a silver-headed walking stick that he carried like a scepter. His eyes were the color of winter ice, pale and cold, and utterly without mercy. Morrison. Blackwood's voice was smooth as oil spreading on water. I hear you have taken in the Dawson family. That is my business. Indeed it is. But there is a small matter that requires resolution. Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. Daniel Dawson owed my bank $200 at the time of his death. According to this contract, the debt transfers to his legal heir, his wife. Caleb took the document, scanning the cramped handwriting, the legal terminology, the signatures at the bottom. Daniel Dawson's name. 2 witnesses. A notary seal from Helena. And then he saw the clause that made his blood run cold. Collateral clause, Blackwood said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. In the event of default, the borrower agrees that family members, including spouse and children, may be placed under contract of indenture to satisfy the outstanding obligation. What are you saying? I am saying that under Montana territorial law, Eleanor Dawson has a legal obligation to repay her husband's debt. If she cannot pay in cash, she can pay in labor. For me. Blackwood smiled, showing teeth that were too white, too perfect. $200 at standard domestic wages. That would be approximately 10 years of service. Caleb stepped closer, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. Daniel Dawson signed this under duress. He signed it voluntarily. I have witnesses. No man in his right mind pledges his wife and children as collateral. Desperate men do desperate things. Blackwood adjusted his gloves, utterly unconcerned by Caleb's barely contained rage. And speaking of Daniel, he did not die of fever, Morrison. He died of pressure. I gave him an opportunity to clear his debt, hand over his wife. He refused. And then he simply broke. You killed him. I never touched him. He did that to himself. Blackwood's smile widened. Now the widow has 2 choices. Pay $200 within 1 week. Or come to work for me. I am being generous with the timeline. Caleb grabbed Blackwood's collar, pulling the banker close enough to smell the pomade in his hair, the expensive tobacco on his breath. Around them, townspeople stopped to stare. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "You will not touch her." Caleb's voice was low and dangerous. "Not ever." Blackwood did not flinch, did not blink. He simply looked at Caleb with those ice-pale eyes and smiled. "Careful, Morrison. You also owe property taxes. $47, if I recall correctly. Due in 2 weeks." He brushed Caleb's hands away, straightening his coat with precise, unhurried movements. "If you want to keep the widow, you will need to pay both amounts. $247 in 2 weeks. Blackwood climbed back into his carriage, pausing at the door to deliver one final blow. "Oh, and one more thing. Ask Mrs. Dawson about the scar on her wrist. Ask her who burned the letter D into her skin. Perhaps then you will understand why Daniel Dawson preferred death to letting his wife fall into my hands." The carriage rolled away, leaving Caleb standing in the muddy street. The contract crumpled in his fist, rage and horror coiling in his chest like snakes. He rode home as darkness fell, the meager supplies tied behind his saddle, his mind churning with everything he had learned. The contract, the debt, Blackwood's threats. The letter D burned into Ellie's wrist. Daniel Dawson had not died of fever. He had died because he refused to give his wife to a monster. And now that monster was coming for her. Ellie was waiting on the porch when Caleb arrived, Grace in her arms, her gray eyes searching his face as he dismounted. She knew something was wrong. She could read it in the set of his shoulders, the hard line of his jaw. "Caleb," she said, "what happened?" Inside, the children were asleep. The fire crackled softly. The cabin smelled of bread baking, of warmth and safety, and all the things Ellie had almost given up hoping for. Caleb placed the contract on the table. "I met Blackwood." The color drained from Ellie's face. Her hands began to tremble. She set Grace in the cradle and sank into a chair, staring at the document as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. "He did not die of fever, did he?" Caleb asked gently. "Daniel." Ellie's eyes filled with tears. She shook her head slowly. "I wanted to tell you." Her voice was barely audible. "I was afraid. Afraid if you knew the truth, you would send us away. Tell me. Everything." And she did. Daniel had borrowed money from Blackwood to buy mining equipment. He had not read the contract carefully. He had not understood the collateral clause until it was too late. When he could not pay, Blackwood came to collect. He wanted me. Ellie's hand went to her wrist, to the scar hidden beneath her sleeve. Daniel refused. They beat him. 3 men. In our home. In front of Hannah. Tears streamed down her face. One of them held me down while another heated an iron in the fire. The letter D for Dawson. For debt. For what Blackwood believed I owed him. And Daniel, he tried to save me. They beat him unconscious. 3 days later, he was dead. The doctor said fever. But it was not fever. It was what they did to him that night. The injuries. The broken bones. And Dr. Webb signed the death certificate saying it was natural causes. Caleb knelt before her, taking her hands in his. The scar was hidden, but he could feel its raised edges beneath the fabric. "Why did you not tell anyone?" "Tell who?" Ellie laughed bitterly. "Sheriff Pruitt owes Blackwood $500. Judge Hawkins owes more. Every lawyer in town works for the bank. The whole system belongs to him. No one believes a poor widow over the richest man in the territory." And Hannah, she saw Ellie nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "She saw everything. She has not slept through the night since. She has nightmares. She screams. She thinks it is her fault because she hid instead of helping." As if summoned by her name, a small figure appeared in the doorway. Hannah stood there in her white nightgown, her feet bare on the cold floor, her eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "Mama," she said, her voice trembling. "I have to tell him." "Tell me what?" Caleb asked gently. Hannah walked slowly into the room. She looked at her mother, then at Caleb. 9 years old, carrying a burden that would have crushed most adults. "I saw them," she whispered, "the night before Papa died. I woke up because of the noise. I came downstairs. I saw 3 men. They were hitting Papa. There was one man watching. Tall, silver hair. He had a walking stick with a silver head. He was smiling while they hurt Papa." Caleb and Ellie exchanged glances. The silver-headed walking stick. Blackwood's signature affectation. They made Papa sign a paper. Hannah continued, her voice growing stronger as the secret she had carried finally spilled out. Papa would not sign at first, so they hurt him more. Then one of them got a hot iron from the fire, and they held Mama down, and Hannah's voice broke. She began to cry great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. I wanted to help. I wanted to scream. But I was so scared, I hid behind the stairs, and I did not do anything. And then Papa died, and it is all my fault. Ellie pulled her daughter into her arms. No, sweetheart. No. It was never your fault. You were a child. You could not have stopped them. Caleb knelt beside them both. Hannah, he said softly, look at me. The girl raised her tear-stained face. What you did took more courage than you know. You survived. You protected your brothers and sisters by staying hidden. You kept this secret to keep them safe. Caleb placed his hand over his heart. And now you have told me. That took bravery. More bravery than most grown men have. Hannah sniffled. Can you make them pay? For Papa, Caleb looked at this child who had witnessed horrors no child should see, who had carried guilt that was never hers to carry, who had been strong when strength seemed impossible. I promise you, he said, and the word father came out as naturally as breathing. I will protect this family, and the men who hurt your papa will pay. I swear it on my life. Hannah nodded. Then she did something she had never done with anyone except her mother. She threw her arms around Caleb's neck and held on like she would never let go. Ellie watched them, tears streaming down her face. And in that moment, something shifted in the cabin. Something that had been broken began to mend. Later, after Hannah had returned to bed, Caleb and Ellie sat by the dying fire. 3 nights passed. 3 nights of planning and hoping and fearing. 3 nights of lying awake in separate corners of the cabin, listening to each other breathe. On the 4th night, the children fell asleep early, exhausted from a day of chores and worry. The cabin grew quiet. The fire burned low. And Caleb found Ellie sitting on the porch wrapped in Maggie's shawl, staring at the stars. He sat down beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to give her space. I have been thinking, Ellie said without looking at him, about what we are doing, what we are becoming. Caleb's heart began to pound. If you want to leave, I do not want to leave. She turned to face him, her eyes bright in the starlight. But I cannot keep pretending this is just charity. The children have stopped asking when we are going home, because they know this is home now, you are home. Ellie, Rose calls you Papa. Tom and Will follow you everywhere. Hannah trusts you more than she has trusted anyone since Daniel died. And she paused, her voice catching. I feel things I did not expect to feel again. Things I thought died with my husband. What kind of things? The kind of things a woman feels for a man she wants to spend her life with. The words hung in the cold air between them. Caleb could hear his own heartbeat loud as thunder in the silence. He could see the fear in her eyes, the vulnerability, the courage it took to speak first. Mrs. Pruitt was right about one thing, Ellie continued, her voice barely above a whisper. If you are going to keep me under your roof, you should marry me. Not for reputation, not for protection, because I want to be your wife. Because I love you, Caleb Morrison. I have loved you since the night you wrapped your arms around Rose and called her sweetheart. I have loved you since you taught Hannah to bake bread and Tom to stack firewood and Will to feed the chickens. I have loved you through every kind word and gentle touch and quiet sacrifice. Caleb stood. For a moment, Ellie's face fell, thinking he was walking away. But he was not walking away. He was kneeling. Right there on the cold wooden porch under a sky full of stars, he knelt before her, the way a man kneels before a queen. I was going to ask you, he said, his voice rough. I have been trying to find the words for days, but you are braver than I am. You have always been braver. Is that a yes? Caleb took her face in his hands, looked into her eyes, saw everything he had lost and everything he could gain, all wrapped up in one woman who had walked through hell and come out fighting. That is a yes, he whispered. That is 1,000 times yes. He kissed her. Soft at first, tentative, like testing the ice on a frozen river. Then deeper, more urgent, as 3 years of loneliness and grief came crashing down around them. She tasted like tears and hope, and something that might have been the future. When they finally broke apart, both of them were trembling. Both of them were smiling. We will marry as soon as we can, Caleb said. Before Blackwood can stop us, before anyone can take this away from us. And if he tries, then he will learn what happens when he threatens my family. Ellie laughed, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Your family. I like the sound of that, so do I, Caleb said. He pulled her close, tucking her head under his chin, feeling her heartbeat against his chest. So do I. They stayed on the porch until the stars began to fade. Two broken people finding in each other the missing pieces they had thought were gone forever. Two survivors choosing to fight instead of run. Two hearts beating as one. Inside the cabin, Hannah stood at the window watching. A small smile crossed her face. The first real smile in weeks. About time, she whispered to herself. Then she went back to bed and, for the first night since her father died, she slept without nightmares. The blizzard came from nowhere. One moment the sky was gray but calm. The next a wall of white descended upon the mountains like the wrath of God swallowing the world whole. Caleb had left for Helena at dawn to sell his horse. $70 for the only transportation he owned. $70 that might mean the difference between survival and destruction. He had kissed Rose on the forehead, squeezed Hannah's shoulder, and promised Ellie he would return before nightfall. He had been wrong. The storm hit at noon, a late winter monster that turned visibility to nothing in minutes. Caleb made it to Helena, sold the horse to a rancher who did not ask questions, and started the long walk home with $70 in his pocket and fear in his heart. In the cabin, Ellie stood at the window, Grace in her arms, watching the white curtain devour everything. The pines disappeared first, then the barn, then the chicken coop just 10 steps from the door. Within an hour, she could not see her own hand pressed against the glass. "Will Mr. Caleb come home?" Rose asked, tugging at her mother's skirt. "Of course, sweetheart." Ellie kept her voice steady, but her hands trembled. "Go back to the fire." The hours crawled past. The storm showed no sign of breaking, and Caleb did not come. By nightfall, Ellie had fed the children and put them to bed. She sat alone by the dying fire, listening to the wind scream against the walls, her mind spiraling into darkness. If Caleb died in the storm, no one would know they were here. No one would come looking. The supplies would run out in days. The children would starve one by one while she watched helplessly. And if he survived, what then? He had sold his horse for her. He had sold his father's watch for her. He was risking everything, sacrificing everything for a woman whose past was nothing but poison. The thought came like a serpent whispering in her ear. If she left, he would be free. If she took the children and disappeared, Blackwood's debt would follow her, not him. Caleb could keep his land, rebuild his life, find a woman who did not drag destruction in her wake. This is the right thing to do, she told herself. This is how I repay his kindness. With shaking hands, she wrote a letter. "Caleb, you have given us everything. I cannot let you lose anything more. Live the life you deserve. A life without the burden of a woman who brings only ruin. May God bless you, Ellie." She woke the children, dressed them in every layer of clothing they possessed, wrapped their feet in rags and blankets. Grace she strapped to her chest, the baby's warmth against her heart, the only thing keeping her moving. "Mama, where are we going?" Hannah asked, her eyes wide with fear. "Away, somewhere safe. But this is safe. Mr. Caleb makes us safe." Ellie could not answer. She simply opened the door and stepped into the howling white. They made it half a mile before the cold began to win. Rose stopped crying first. She went silent and limp in Ellie's arms, her small body surrendering to the freeze. The twins stumbled and fell, too exhausted to stand. Hannah dragged them forward, her thin arms wrapped around their waists, her face blue with cold, but her jaw set with determination. "We have to go back." Hannah gasped. "Mama, we have to go back." But Ellie could no longer tell which direction was back. The snow had erased all landmarks. The wind changed direction every few seconds. They were lost in a white void with no up, no down, no escape. Then she heard it. A voice, faint at first, swallowed by the wind, then louder, closer. A man's voice, raw with desperation. "Ellie," she turned. A shape emerged from the white wall. A man covered in snow ice crusting his beard, his clothes frozen stiff. He moved toward them like a ghost, like a miracle, like salvation itself. "Caleb." He reached them and grabbed her shoulders, his grip so tight it hurt. His face was a mask of fury and terror, and something else she could not name. "Are you insane?" he shouted over the wind. "You will kill them all out here. I was trying to save you." Ellie screamed back. "I am a disaster. Everything I touch turns to ruin. Daniel died because of me. You will lose everything because of me. Look at me." Caleb took her face in his frozen hands, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Look at me, Eleanor." She looked, and what she saw there stopped her breath. "You are not a disaster. You are the best thing that has happened to me in 3 years. You and these children woke me from the dead. I was a ghost walking through a life I did not want. Then you knocked on my door, and everything changed. But the debt, the land, your horse, I would sell my soul to keep you safe. Do you understand?" Caleb's voice cracked. "I love you, Eleanor Dawson. I have loved you since the night you offered to die so your children could live. I am not letting you go. Not now, not ever." Grace began to cry against Ellie's chest. Rose stirred weakly in her arms. The twins were barely conscious, held upright only by Hannah's desperate grip. "Now we go home," Caleb said, "and we face whatever comes together." He lifted Rose and one of the twins. Hannah took the other. Ellie clutched Grace and followed Caleb through the white hell step by frozen step, until finally, impossibly, the cabin emerged from the snow like a beacon of hope. They stumbled inside. Caleb rebuilt the fire. Ellie stripped the frozen clothes from the children, wrapped them in every blanket they owned, forced warm water and honey between their blue lips. By dawn, the storm had passed. The children were safe, and Ellie sat across from Caleb, exhausted but alive, ready to tell him everything she had held back. Daniel did not just owe money. Her voice was hollow. He discovered what Blackwood was really doing. For 10 years, Blackwood has been stealing land from families across the territory. The same scheme every time. Predatory loans, impossible terms. And when people cannot pay, he threatens them, hurts them, sometimes kills them. How many families? At least 6 that Daniel found. Maybe more. He was gathering evidence. He wanted to report it to the territorial governor. That is why they killed him. 6 families. Caleb stared into the fire. 6 families destroyed by one man. Daniel said Blackwood keeps records. A ledger with everything written down. Every transaction, every bribe, every death. He was obsessed with documenting his conquests. Ellie shook her head. "But I do not know where the ledger is. It died with Daniel." Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then he looked up, and there was iron in his eyes. "We find it. We find the other families. We build a case so strong that even Blackwood cannot escape. No one will believe us. Someone will. We just have to find them." 5 days later, Caleb began his investigation. Without a horse, he walked 5 miles to this farm, 7 miles to that homestead, 10 miles to the remnants of what had once been thriving ranches, now abandoned, their owners scattered or dead. Old Tom Garrett guided him. The 67-year-old veteran knew every family that had lost land to Blackwood. He knew the widows working as servants in houses that had once been their own. He knew the orphans sent to institutions when their parents died mysteriously. "Your father saved my life at Gettysburg," Tom told Caleb, as they trudged through the melting snow. "I have been waiting 20 years to repay that debt. This is my chance." They found Jacob Henriksen first. 70 years old, living in a shack at the edge of town, surviving on charity and bitterness. His wife had fallen into a well 1 week after refusing to sign over their farm. The well had been covered for 10 years. No one asked how she fell through boards that had supported wagon wheels. They found Martha Miller next, a 60-year-old widow scrubbing floors in the house that had been her home before Blackwood took it. Her husband had died in a mining accident the day after telling Blackwood he would never sell. The mine had been closed for inspection. No one was supposed to be inside. They found the Patterson brothers, Jim and Robert, working as hired hands on land their father had cleared with his own hands. Their father had shot himself with a gun he had never owned in a room that was locked from the outside. 6 families, 6 suspicious deaths, 6 fortunes transferred to Silas Blackwood through contracts signed under duress. But still no proof, no ledger, no document that could stand up in court. Then Clara Blackwood came. She arrived at the cabin on a moonless night, her face hidden beneath a hooded cloak, her horse lathered from hard riding. She was 19 years old, blonde hair, blue eyes, a face that bore an unsettling resemblance to the man Caleb had sworn to destroy. "Mr. Morrison," her voice trembled. "I am Clara Blackwood. I am his niece. Please let me in before someone sees." "Why should I trust you?" "Because I have this." She pulled a leather-bound book from beneath her cloak. Even in the dim light, Caleb could see it was old, worn, filled with cramped handwriting. "I am not his daughter. Clara spoke quickly, her words tumbling over each other. I am the daughter of his brother Frederick. My father discovered what my uncle was doing 5 years ago. He threatened to expose everything. 2 weeks later, my father fell from his horse and broke his neck. My mother died of grief 3 months later. I have lived in my uncle's house ever since, a prisoner in all but name. Caleb stared at the book. Is that what I think it is, my uncle's private ledger? Every crime he has ever committed, every bribe, every murder, every piece of land he has stolen. Clara's eyes burned with hatred. He keeps it in his private safe. He takes it out sometimes and reads it like other men read scripture. He is proud of what he has done. She thrust the book toward Caleb. I have spent 3 years copying it, page by page, night after night, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Caleb took the ledger, opened it, and saw everything. Names and dates, dollar amounts, descriptions of accidents arranged and deaths covered up. Dr. Webb's fees for falsified death certificates. Sheriff Pruitt's payments for looking the other way. Judges bought, witnesses silenced. A decade of evil documented in meticulous detail. This is enough to hang him, Caleb said softly. I know. Clara's voice hardened. I want to watch. 2 days later, Caleb met Henry Aldridge. The young lawyer had arrived in Redemption Springs 3 months earlier, hanging his shingle in a cramped office above the pharmacy. He took cases no one else would touch, defended people no one else would represent, and he asked questions that made powerful men nervous. My father was Benjamin Aldridge. Henry explained when Caleb showed him the ledger. He owned a ranch in Butte. Blackwood wanted the land. My father refused to sell. 6 months later, he shot himself. Except my father had never owned a gun in his life, and the wound was in the back of his head. You came here for revenge. I came here for justice. Henry's jaw tightened. I have been building a case against Blackwood for 2 years, but I never had evidence until now. He looked at the ledger with something like reverence. This changes everything. We can take this to the territorial governor, to federal marshals, to newspapers in Helena and Butte, and even back east. Blackwood's empire is built on secrets. Once those secrets are exposed, it all comes crashing down. When Caleb asked, "Your wedding?" Henry smiled grimly. "You are marrying Mrs. Dawson at the town hall. Correct, Blackwood will be there. He cannot resist the opportunity to humiliate you both in public. We give him exactly what he wants, and then we spring the trap." The pieces fell into place over the following days. Old Tom gathered the witnesses. Henriksen, Martha Miller, the Patterson brothers, 6 people who had lost everything to Blackwood, ready to tell their stories at last. Reverend Whitfield prepared the ceremony. He would perform the wedding as planned. And when Blackwood made his move, the Reverend would step aside and let justice take the stage. Clara Blackwood remained hidden at the cabin, protected by Ellie and the children. She would appear at the critical moment, the niece testifying against the uncle, the final nail in the coffin. And Ellie spent the nights before the wedding sitting with Caleb on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Terrified. You could still walk away. Pretend none of this happened. Let Blackwood win." Caleb took her hand. 3 months ago, I was a dead man. I breathed. I ate. I worked. But I was not alive. Then you knocked on my door with 5 starving children and nowhere else to go. And you gave me something I thought I had lost forever. What a reason to fight, Caleb squeezed her hand. I am not walking away, Eleanor. Not from you, not from the children, not from this. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it together. Ellie leaned her head against his shoulder. The stars wheeled overhead. In the cabin behind them, 5 children slept peacefully, unaware that tomorrow would change everything. And in the darkness, Silas Blackwood polished his silver-headed walking stick, dreaming of the humiliation he would inflict on the widow and the fool who had taken her in. He had no idea that his own destruction was already written in the stars. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. Spring had finally broken through winter's grip. Snow melted in rivers down the mountainsides. Birds sang in the pine trees for the first time in months. The air smelled of wet earth and new beginnings of promises waiting to be kept. Ellie stood before the small mirror in the cabin, wearing a white dress that had belonged to old Tom Garrett's wife 30 years ago. The fabric was yellowed with age, the lace slightly frayed, but Clara Blackwood had worked miracles with needle and thread. The dress fit as if it had been made for her. "You look beautiful, Mama." Hannah stood behind her mother, holding Grace on her hip. The 9-year-old had not smiled in weeks. Today, something like hope flickered in her ancient eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart." Rose tugged at Ellie's skirt. "Is today the day you marry Papa Caleb?" "Yes, baby. Today is the day. And then he will be our Papa forever." Ellie knelt down, gathering her youngest daughter close. Forever and ever, the twins burst through the door, tracking mud across the clean floor. Tom and Will had spent the morning helping Caleb with the animals, their faces flushed with excitement and cold air. "Mama, there are so many people going to town." Will's eyes were wide, wagons and horses everywhere. "The whole territory is coming." Tom added, "Mr. Garrett says it is the biggest thing to happen since the railroad came through." Ellie's stomach tightened. The whole territory was coming, yes, but not for a wedding. They were coming for a spectacle. Coming to watch the poor widow and the foolish rancher be humiliated by the most powerful man in Montana. They had no idea what was really about to happen. Caleb appeared in the doorway. He wore his father's gray wool suit, the same suit he had worn when he married Maggie 3 years ago. The fabric was slightly moth-eaten, the cut old-fashioned, but he stood tall and straight with his shoulders back and his jaw set. For a moment, Ellie simply looked at him. This man who had opened his door to strangers, who had given everything he owned to feed children not his own, who had faced down Silas Blackwood without flinching. She loved him. She had known it for weeks, but standing here now, watching him watch her, the truth of it hit her like a physical blow. "You look beautiful," he said softly. "You do not look so bad yourself." Caleb crossed the room and took her hands. His palms were rough with calluses, warm despite the morning chill. "Whatever happens today," he said, "remember that I love you. I have loved you since the night you knocked on my door. And I will love you until the day I die." Ellie blinked back tears. "I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." "Then let us go get married." The Redemption Springs Town Hall had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled. People stood along the walls, crammed into corners, spilled out onto the wooden porch. Ranchers from 20 miles away, miners from the mountains, shopkeepers and farmers and their wives and children. The entire town had turned out, drawn by rumor and curiosity and the promise of drama. Caleb led Ellie down the center aisle. The children walked behind them. Hannah carrying Grace, the twins holding Rose's hands. A family moving together toward an uncertain future. Reverend Whitfield stood at the front of the room, his white hair gleaming in the light from the tall windows. His Bible was open, but his eyes watched the door, waiting. Caleb took his place before the makeshift altar. Ellie stood beside him. The children settled into the front row, guarded by old Tom Garrett on one side, and Clara Blackwood still cloaked and hooded on the other. The crowd murmured and whispered. Where was Blackwood? Would he really come? What would happen when he did? They did not have to wait long. The doors burst open with a crash that echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Silas Blackwood strode in as if he owned the building, which in a sense he did. His black coat billowed behind him. His silver-headed walking stick struck the wooden floor with each step. Behind him walked Sheriff Roy Pruitt, hand on his pistol, and two massive men with scarred knuckles and dead eyes. The same men who had beaten Daniel Dawson to death. Stop this ceremony. Blackwood's voice rang out, silencing the crowd. This marriage cannot proceed. The murmuring exploded into gasps and whispers. Heads turned, eyes widened. This was what they had come to see. Reverend Whitfield closed his Bible calmly. On what grounds? On the grounds that the bride is the legal property of my bank. Blackwood produced a document from his coat, waving it like a flag of conquest. Eleanor Dawson owes $200 against her deceased husband's debt. Under territorial law, she cannot enter into any legal contract, including marriage, until that debt is satisfied. Ellie felt the blood drain from her face. Beside her, Caleb stood perfectly still, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the controlled fury in his eyes. That law does not exist. A voice rang out from the crowd. Henry Aldridge stepped forward, his young face hard with determination. I am a licensed attorney in Montana Territory. There is no statute preventing a debtor from marrying. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Who are you, Henry Aldridge? son of Benjamin Aldridge, the rancher you murdered in Butte 4 years ago." The crowd erupted. Blackwood's face flushed red, then white. "That is a slanderous accusation. My attorneys will see you disbarred. Your attorneys will be too busy defending you against charges of fraud, extortion, and murder." Aldridge held up the leather-bound ledger. "Do you recognize this, Mr. Blackwood?" For the first time, something like fear flickered in Blackwood's ice-pale eyes. "Where did you get that?" "From someone who knows your secrets. Someone who has watched you destroy families for a decade. Someone who has been waiting for this moment." Caleb stepped forward, taking the ledger from Aldridge. He opened it and began to read aloud. October 15th, 1876. Acquired Henriksen property. Total debt claimed $300. Actual debt $47. Arranged accident for wife. He looked up at the crowd. Mrs. Henriksen fell into a well that had been sealed for 10 years. Her husband signed over his farm 3 days later. Jacob Henriksen rose from his seat, 70 years old and trembling with rage. She did not fall. "You killed her. I have known it for 8 years. I was too afraid to speak." "Not anymore." March 3rd, 1879. Caleb continued reading. Acquired Miller property. Arranged mining accident. Payment to Dr. Webb for death certificate, $50. Martha Miller stood, tears streaming down her face. "My husband never went into that mine. He was afraid of the dark. You dragged him down there and left him to die." November 12th, 1880. Acquired Patterson property. Staged suicide. Note forged by Pruitt. Sheriff Pruitt went pale. His hand dropped from his pistol. He took a step back as if trying to distance himself from the man he had served. Jim and Robert Patterson stood together, their faces carved from stone. Our father was left-handed. The gun was in his right hand, and he was shot in the back of the head. Blackwood's face had gone from white to gray. He looked around the room, searching for allies, finding none. Even his hired thugs seemed uncertain, glancing at each other at the doors, calculating their chances of escape. "This is preposterous." Blackwood's voice cracked. "These are forgeries, lies. I will sue everyone in this room." "Then perhaps you would like to hear from a witness." Caleb nodded toward the back of the hall. "Someone who lived in your house. Someone who watched you gloat over this ledger night after night. Someone who knows exactly what kind of monster you are." Clara Blackwood stood. She pulled back her hood, revealing her face to the stunned crowd. The resemblance to her uncle was unmistakable. The same blonde hair, the same blue eyes, but where his eyes were cold, hers burned with righteous fury. "Uncle!" Her voice carried across the silent hall. "Did you miss me?" Blackwood staggered as if he had been struck. "Clara, what are you doing?" "What I should have done 5 years ago, when you killed my father, when you drove my mother to her grave, when you took me into your house and made me watch while you destroyed family after family." Clara walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her gaze never leaving her uncle's face. "I copied every page of that ledger, every name, every date, every crime. I have been waiting for someone brave enough to use it." She stopped in front of him, close enough to touch. "And now I am going to watch you hang, you ungrateful wretch." Blackwood raised his walking stick as if to strike her. "I gave you everything. I took you in when you had nothing. You took me in so you could control me, so you could keep me silent." Clara did not flinch, but I was never silent. I was just waiting. The crowd had gone utterly still. Even the children watched with wide eyes, sensing that something momentous was happening, something that would be talked about for generations. Reverend Whitfield stepped forward, his white hair gleaming, his voice ringing with authority. "Silas Blackwood, before God and this community, you stand accused of fraud, extortion, and the murder of at least 6 people, including Frederick Blackwood, your own brother. What do you have to say?" Blackwood looked around the room one last time, at the witnesses standing against him, at the ledger in Caleb's hands, at his niece, her face a mirror of his own, twisted with hatred he had created. Then his shoulders slumped. The silver-headed walking stick clattered to the floor, and Silas Blackwood, the most powerful man in Montana Territory, looked suddenly old and small and utterly defeated. Sheriff Pruitt Aldridge said calmly, "I believe you have a duty to perform." Pruitt hesitated. His wife sat in the front row, her face pale with shock. The crowd watched him, waiting to see what he would do. waiting to see if he would stand with the monster he had served or finally choose the right side. Roy. Mrs. Pruitt's voice was barely a whisper. Did you know? Did you know what he was doing? Pruitt swallowed hard. He looked at his wife, at the crowd, at the broken man before him. Then he pulled out his handcuffs. Silas Blackwood, you are under arrest for fraud, extortion, and murder. You will be held until the territorial marshal arrives. He clicked the cuffs around Blackwood's wrists. May God have mercy on your soul. The two hired thugs tried to run. They made it 3 steps before the Patterson brothers tackled them to the ground. The crowd surged forward, not with violence, but with a kind of collective exhale, as if the whole town had been holding its breath for a decade and finally could breathe again. Caleb turned to Ellie. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. Reverend Whitfield cleared his throat. He was smiling too. Well then, if there are no further objections, perhaps we should finish what we started. The crowd laughed. The tension broke like a fever. And in the midst of chaos and injustice, in the downfall of a tyrant, Reverend Whitfield raised his Bible once more. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Caleb Morrison and Eleanor Dawson. Ellie took Caleb's hands. His grip was warm and strong and steady. Do you, Caleb Morrison, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health for richer or for poorer, until death do you part? I do. Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. I have since the night that she knocked on my door. The crowd chuckled through their tears. And do you, Eleanor Dawson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Ellie looked at Caleb, at this man who had saved her, who had fought for her, who had given her something she thought she would never have again. I do. Caleb slid the ring onto her finger. Maggie's ring, blessed by the past, claimed by the present. Then by the power vested in me by God in the Montana Territory, I pronounce you husband and wife. Whitfield's eyes twinkled. You may kiss your bride. Caleb kissed her, and the hall erupted in cheers. Outside, after the ceremony, the townspeople lined up to offer congratulations and gifts. A bag of flour here, a basket of eggs there, a quilt sewn by women who had closed their doors in Ellie's face just weeks before. Old Tom Garrett pressed a goat into Caleb's hands. For milk, for the children. Martha Miller brought a rocking chair she had saved from her old home. For the baby, for Grace. Even Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt approached her face stiff with something that might have been shame. I was wrong about you, she said to Ellie. I hope you can forgive me. Ellie looked at this woman who had called her shameless, who had turned her away from the church doors, who had judged her without knowing anything about her life. Forgiveness is a choice, Ellie said quietly. Today I choose to make it. Caleb helped his family into the wagon old Tom had loaned them. Hannah sat beside him, Grace in her arms. The twins and Rose piled into the back, chattering excitedly about everything they had seen. As they rode home, Ellie leaned her head against Caleb's shoulder. Is it over, she asked. The trial will take months, Caleb said. Blackwood has lawyers. There will be appeals. But yes, it is over. He is finished. What happens now? Now Caleb smiled, a real smile, the first she had seen since she met him. Now we go home. We plant crops. We raise children. We build a life. Rose tugged at his sleeve. Papa Caleb, yes, sweetheart. Are we a real family now? Caleb looked at Ellie, at Hannah holding Grace, at the twins wrestling in the wagon bed, at this little girl with her mother's gray eyes and her father's stubborn chin. We are a real family. Forever. The wagon rolled toward home. The spring sun warmed their faces. And somewhere behind them in a jail cell that smelled of dust and defeat, Silas Blackwood sat alone with the ruins of his empire. Justice had come to Redemption Springs at last. 3 months later, Caleb stood on the porch of the cabin he had once thought would be his tomb. Summer had transformed the ranch. The garden Ellie had planted was thick with vegetables, corn and beans and squash and potatoes enough to feed 8 people through winter. Chickens scratched in the yard more than he had ever owned before gifts from grateful neighbors. A new horse grazed in the pasture bought with money returned from Blackwood's seized assets. The trial in Helena had ended 2 weeks ago. Silas Blackwood was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Dr. Webb received 10 years. The 2 hired thugs would hang in the fall for the murders they had committed. Sheriff Pruitt had resigned in disgrace, replaced by a federal marshal who answered to no one in Redemption Springs. Clara Blackwood had used her inheritance to open a school. Hannah was her first student learning to read and write, and Cypher learning to be a child again instead of a guardian. Caleb watched his family moving through the afternoon light. Hannah sat on the porch steps with a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. The twins chased each other through the yard, their laughter ringing across the meadow. Rose helped Ellie hang laundry, her small hands clumsy but eager. And Ellie stood at the clothesline, one hand on her swollen belly, the other pinning a sheet to the line. She was beautiful in the summer sun, her brown hair loose around her shoulders, her gray eyes soft with contentment. She caught him watching and smiled. "The doctor came by this morning," she said. "While you were in the barn." "What did he say?" Ellie's smile widened. "November, and it might be twins." Caleb stood very still. The world seemed to narrow to this moment, this woman, this news that changed everything. "Twins," he repeated. "Are you happy?" He crossed the yard in 3 strides and took her in his arms, careful of her belly, breathing in the scent of her hair. "I am terrified," he admitted, "and happier than I have ever been in my life." That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Ellie walked to the small cemetery behind the cabin. 2 graves lay there marked by simple wooden crosses. Margaret Morrison, beloved wife, and a smaller cross beside it, unmarked, for the son who had never drawn breath. Caleb knelt and placed wildflowers on both graves. The first flowers of summer, bright and fragile and full of hope. "You sent her to me," he said to Maggie's grave. "I know you did. And I will love her enough for both of us. I will raise these children to know your name. I will make you proud." Ellie knelt beside him, her hand finding his. "She would have liked you," Caleb said. "I hope so." They stayed there for a long moment, the living and the dead, sharing space in the summer twilight. Then Ellie said quietly, "Some winters break us. Some winters remake us." Caleb nodded. "And this winter," he helped her to her feet, holding her close. "This winter gave me everything." The summer stretched on long and golden and full of small miracles. Hannah learned to read well enough to help the younger children with their letters. She would sit on the porch in the evenings, a book in her lap, reading aloud, while Rose curled against her side and the twins listened with sleepy eyes. Her voice grew stronger with each passing week. The haunted look began to fade from her eyes. She was becoming herself again, the child she had been before that terrible night. Tom and Will discovered a talent for working with animals. They adopted a stray dog that wandered onto the property, a half-starved mutt with one torn ear and a crooked tail. They named him Sergeant after a character in one of Hannah's books, and within a month he followed them everywhere, sleeping at the foot of their bed, guarding them with the fierce devotion of a creature who had finally found his pack. Rose remained Caleb's shadow. She helped him in the barn, her small hands learning to measure feed and check water levels. She sat beside him while he mended fences, handing him nails and asking endless questions. She fell asleep in his lap every evening, her thumb in her mouth, her breathing soft and steady against his chest. And Grace the baby, who had arrived at his door with blue lips and barely a heartbeat, grew fat and happy and loud. She crawled across the cabin floor with determined focus, pulling herself up on furniture legs but babbling nonsense that Ellie swore was her first attempts at words. The community that had once turned its back on Ellie began to change. Neighbors who had closed their doors now brought gifts of food and clothing. Women who had whispered behind their hands now stopped to chat at the mercantile. Men who had looked the other way now tipped their hats and offered help with the heavier work. It was not forgiveness exactly. It was something more complicated, a recognition that they had failed and a determination to do better. A community finding its conscience, one small act of kindness at a time. Clara Blackwood's school grew quickly. By midsummer, she had 12 students and plans to expand. She taught reading and writing and arithmetic, but she also taught history and philosophy and critical thinking. Her students learned to question authority, to seek evidence, to think for themselves. "They will not be fooled like their parents were," Clara told Caleb one afternoon as they watched the children playing in the schoolyard. "They will know how to recognize a tyrant when they see one." "Will that be enough?" Clara smiled, a fierce expression that transformed her face. "It is a start. The rest is up to them." Henry Aldridge left for Washington in August, carrying copies of the ledger and sworn statements from every witness they had gathered. He promised to return with federal marshals, with newspaper reporters, with anyone who would listen. "This story needs to be told," he said before he boarded the stagecoach. "Not just for the people Blackwood hurt, but for the people he might have hurt. Every tyrant starts small. If we had stopped him 10 years ago, how many lives would we have saved? Caleb shook his hand. Make sure they listen. I will, Aldridge promised. If I have to stand on the steps of the Capitol and shout until I lose my voice, I will make them listen. The nights grew shorter. The harvest came in abundant beyond anything Caleb had expected. Corn and wheat and vegetables enough to fill the root cellar twice over. Meat from the hunt salted and smoked and stored for the long winter ahead. By September, Ellie's belly had grown round and heavy. She moved more slowly now, one hand always resting on the curve of her stomach, a small smile playing at her lips when she felt the baby's kick. Twins the doctor had confirmed on his last visit, 2 heartbeats strong and steady. November, maybe early December. Hard to say with multiples. Caleb spent his evenings building a cradle. 2 cradles actually side by side carved from the same pine tree that shaded Maggie's grave. He worked by lamplight, sanding the wood until it was smooth as silk, carving small flowers and animals into the headboards. For luck, he told Ellie when she asked about the designs. My mother carved the same patterns on my cradle, said they would keep the bad dreams away. Did they work? Caleb thought about his childhood, about the nightmares that had plagued him after his father went off to war, about the carved rabbit on his headboard, the one he had traced with his finger every night until sleep finally came. Yes, he said, they worked. October brought the first frost. The leaves turned gold and red and orange, painting the mountains in colors that made Ellie catch her breath every morning. The children started wearing extra layers. Sergeant Dupont grew a thick winter coat. The chickens huddled together in their coop, laying fewer eggs, but somehow producing exactly enough. And then on a cold night in early November, Ellie woke Caleb with a hand on his shoulder and a calm voice that belied the fear in her eyes. It is time, she said. The labor lasted 18 hours, the longest 18 hours of Caleb's life. He paced the porch. He prayed to a God he had stopped believing in. He held Ellie's hand until she screamed and squeezed until his bones creaked. The midwife, a stern woman named Mrs. Patterson, who had delivered half the babies in the territory, worked with quiet efficiency. She gave orders. She boiled water. She told Caleb to stop hovering and make himself useful. Somewhere in the depths of that endless night, Hannah appeared at his side. She did not speak. She simply took his hand and held it, 9 years old and steadier than any adult had a right to expect. Mama is strong, Hannah said. She will be fine. How do you know? Because she has something to live for now. Hannah squeezed his hand. She has you. She has us. She has a future worth fighting for. At dawn, the first baby came. A boy, red-faced and squalling with a shock of dark hair and lungs that could wake the dead. An hour later, the second baby arrived. A girl, smaller than her brother, quieter, with eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. Caleb held them both, one in each arm, and felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen for 3 years, sealed tight against the possibility of more loss. They are beautiful, he whispered. Ellie, exhausted but radiant, smiled from the bed. They are ours. The boy they named Daniel, after Ellie's first husband. A man who had given his life to protect his family. A man who deserved to be remembered. The girl they named Margaret, after Caleb's first wife. A woman who had believed in second chances. A woman who had, in her own way, sent Ellie to his door. Daniel and Margaret Morrison. Twins born in the first light of a November morning. Children of 2 broken people who had found in each other the strength to be whole. Winter came again, as it always did. Snow piled against the cabin walls. Wind howled through the pines. The temperature dropped until the air itself seemed to freeze. But this time Caleb did not face it alone. This time there was laughter in the cabin. There was warmth by the fire. There were 7 children sleeping soundly in beds he had built with his own hands, and a woman he loved more than life itself resting beside him. This time winter was not an enemy to be endured. It was simply a season to be survived, one day at a time together. On Christmas Eve, they gathered around the fire. All of them. Hannah read from a book of stories. The twins played with carved wooden horses Caleb had made. Rose helped Ellie prepare a special dinner. Grace and the twins, Daniel and Margaret, slept in their cradles, peaceful and oblivious to the celebration around them. Caleb looked at his family, at the faces lit by firelight, at the love that filled every corner of this cabin that had once been his tomb. Some winters break us, he thought. Some winters remake us. and some winters, against all odds, give us everything we never knew we needed. Outside, snow fell softly on the graves behind the cabin, on Maggie, on the son who had never drawn breath, on all the dreams that had died in this hard country. But inside there was life, there was love, there was hope. And for Caleb Morrison, after everything he had lost and everything he had found, that was more than enough. It was everything.